Thank you very much. I am greatly appreciative of my colleague, Professor Magnet's very useful and practical PowerPoint presentation. I regret that I do not have one to share. So allow me to provide a somewhat different perspective, which is primarily rooted in politics. But before doing so, let me express my gratitude for the invitation to address you. Let me present my highest regards and respect to the honorable traditional leaders and to other authorities who are present, and to my co-panelists, esteemed co-panelists. As was mentioned in your introduction, I've had the honor and challenge. So I was just remarking that my professional experience is primarily involved in the negotiation and advising on processes, as was mentioned, in now well more than 50 situations in the world, including partly in your region. And I do not know much about, but I have worked specifically in South Sudan and in Somalia, and I have shared some views in Sudan. I've also helped advise upon and conduct an evaluation of the genocide in Tigray, or against Tigrayans, and I know something of the Ethiopian Authority. So this informs my remarks. I say that because the essence of what is in discussion is political. One of the greatest legal theorists of the last century, Hirsch Lauterpacht, famously observed that 90% of international law is politics. I would argue that a large part of all law, in particular of the character we are discussing, the structure of power and the state, is essentially politics. And in this, I have to observe immediately that the current situation globally and in many countries is not conducive to progressive developments in the sense of seeking either enlightened approaches or magnanimity or similar attitudes. The current prevailing political reality around the world is very much one of volatility, one of repression, and as was observed in the last United Nations General Assembly, there are now more violent conflicts in the world today than ever since the end of the Second World War. And many are on your continent and your neighborhood. So this is a fact that needs to be taken into account. I'm glad that you are focusing on the idea of internal self-determination, but let me just say a few words about this. Because internal self-determination is neither a term of law, nor, to my knowledge, nor a term even of really of the art of international relations so far. It is largely confined to scholarly ideas, and rather there actually are treaty obligations, including in the UN Charter and in the Article 1 of the two covenants on civil, political, and economic, social, and cultural rights of the United Nations, which explicitly stipulate the right of self-determination in not very clear language, but I want to emphasize what they actually do say, because it's informative for us. And it says that of course, all peoples have the right of self-determination. It's not quite clear who peoples applies to, but it says by virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And I wish to underline those two ideas. They freely determine political status and freely pursue economic, social, and cultural development. So, in other words, the focus or the essence of the self-determination is one of status and of development. In other words, substantive elements which relate to the way we live, to the benefits we may receive or obtain through structures of governance, and they do so in relation to others. For example, to pursue development means to negotiate it, to be able to actually determine one's interests and aims, but then to pursue it is an interactive process with others who may be necessary, for example, through trade or through means of investment and so forth. Internal self-determination has otherwise been expressed in some other words which are also problematical, such as autonomy, and a term which very much causes allergic reactions to many in positions of authority within states. Another phrase is self-governance, or sometimes self-rule. And these, including self-determination, are not very precise ideas. In fact, one might argue they are oxymoronic, that is to say, they are self-contradictory. For example, nobody, no state, no community, no individual literally determines themselves. That's an imagined idea which is materially false. One only can determine in relation to others. For example, a border. A border will be ultimately a function of either force or in relation to others or negotiated settlement. And that is also true of imagined borders, such as jurisdictional authorities. Now, there are many variations of these ideas in relation to others, and the language which has been developed in a lot of contemporary situations is not the language of self-determination or even of autonomy or self-governance, but is in relation to forms of effective participation, particularly for persons or groups who seek to have a substantial voice or say, or specifically control over things which either largely or specifically affect them. I'll give you two examples. For example, a linguistic community, which is unique in its linguistic characteristic, should and actually seeks uniquely to control the language rules, what constitute grammar, what constitute vocabulary, and so forth with regard to the community of speakers of that language. And that is really not something that non-speakers have any competence or usually much interest in affecting. A very different thing would be a question of economic development, which particularly may depend upon geographic or trade relations with others, which by its character, the beneficiaries have an interest in, but cannot uniquely determine, and therefore they would be affected and they wish to have and they need to have some voice, but will ultimately depend upon a negotiation with others who are also affected to either a greater or lesser extent. This raises a question that such matters may also be in their character shared. In other words, the notion of independence, the idea that one is not dependent upon others and may unilaterally make determinations, is increasingly in the world in which we live a semi-fictional or imagined idea that is encumbered by our global interdependence. for example, on environmental matters, such as climate change and so forth. But this is true with regard to, for example, currency exchanges, pandemics. We could discuss many other elements affecting real life, where the notion of independence is a proposition less and less supported by factual reality. And in fact, our mutual interests in things like good health or well-being depend increasingly upon shared arrangements, where we not only have shared interests to greater or lesser extent, but where the management of the subject matter, its arrangements and its implementation mechanisms depends entirely on a cooperative approach, a collaborative even approach, which is not conducive to ideas of separating independent and non-independent arrangements. This relates to another concept I wish to just introduce, which is the concept of viability. This is often discussed with regard to different arrangements, political arrangements, whether the unit, whether that's a geographic or territorial unit or a unit of population, have the viability of their own self-management and their own conduct reliable for others, because if there is no viability, then this means that the arrangement which might be imagined cannot in fact be realized and will create additional problems, including for other affected parties. Now, I would argue that the more easily, attainably viable an arrangement may be, the greater chances that it will in fact be implemented or realized. And that's an important point for another reason, which is the idea of creating relationships which generate mutual benefit and are therefore a basis for building a virtuous cycle of arrangements that can over time increase or expand the degrees of effective participation or the amount of voice and say, and even the amount of control, relatively speaking, that a group would seek to have over any particular matter. Now, this analysis I'm sharing right now is often viewed within the framework of interest-based analysis and negotiations, which is to say that any person or group would identify what are the material and immaterial concerns they have, for example, over their economic well-being or over their identity, cultural and other identity elements, in which the group wishes or prefers to pursue its own development, and then to create priorities amongst those interests for themselves, and then to calculate the way in which those priorities of their own interests match or conflict with the parallel or reciprocal interests of other communities within which they find themselves, either as neighbors or mixed in some ways, for example, different communities sharing the same geographic space. This interest-based approach is fundamental to negotiation, because in the process of negotiation, the question is not what is it you want, the question is going to be what is it that is compatible between the different desires of the participating groups or actors. Where is that area, or what's often called a zone of possible agreement between the different communities? In this, I'll also just note and take it for granted in this case that what is also fundamental is the quality and the character of a representative community or body. I understand, and I must admit, I know very little about your own situation, factually, But having clarity around authentic representation that endures over time and has its own internal coherence is very important for purposes of negotiation and specifically in identifying the priorities of interest in which may be specifically negotiated. You might say, well, why do you care about that? I care about all of this because at the end of the day, the chances of success for any agreement are going to turn on the degree of recognition, authentic and genuine recognition, not only by your immediately affected counterparts, but by others who may be observing and affected, for example, regional players or the international community more broadly. Now, all of that said, it's very important for one to be aware of the political context in which any of this may be pursued. And I regret to say that the current political context in the world is not very propitious or very accommodating at the moment to these kinds of initiatives or negotiations. In fact, to the contrary, you must be observing there is enormous resistance, and there has been a tendency to resort to violence on the part particularly of those who have the means to repress or suppress, and this has been in extreme terms. So I think it's very important not to be naive or to be wishful thinking, but to be sober in one's evaluation. And we could certainly look at situations in your own region which have resulted in extreme destruction. But this is true in other places in which I work, such as Ukraine, such as Myanmar, Georgia now, where things are getting worse and appear to be heading in that direction, where the costs of these pursuits are enormous and possibly irreparable. I mention that because that raises a question about timing. When is it best to pursue certain avenues, and what would be the best forms to present and advocate one's interests and concerns? And here I would suggest a few things that may be helpful. One is technology is changing rapidly, and this is changing the way in which relations are actually realized or experienced. So in internal self-determination, we usually make the distinction between territorial arrangements, where either jurisdictional authority or at least institutions may be created with a territorial or a geographic scope, as opposed to non-territorial arrangements, which relate to associations of peoples, tribes, communities, linguistic groups, other groups of people who can be formed into representative bodies, and they may amongst themselves either possess a jurisdictional authority or have certain institutions which serve their interests. Technology is transforming these relationships. So many things which historically were dependent on territory, for example, access to certain resources, are increasingly being able to be realized or are being affected by telecommunications and other means which are frontier in their character. This is especially important, for example, for linguistic or identity-based communities who may be dispersed but are actually able to live coherently together on a non-territorial basis. So this is something to think about in terms of the priorities of the afar people. What are the specific concerns? And I mean very specific, a kind of list of interests. Do the afar people, if we talk about external self-determination, think about establishing an armed forces? establishing border guards, printing money. Those are classic elements of statehood. I'm assuming that's not what we're discussing. So what are we discussing? Are we discussing taxation? Are we discussing environmental issues? Are we discussing specific economic, trade, or other issues, identity issues, language, education? If these are the issues, then they may be more conducively imagined and actually realized through the progressive use of technology. What's important about that is that over time, you may gain time in the building of relationships with persons who would otherwise oppose your increased voice or your increased jurisdictional authority. Central authorities may, in historical context, be opposed or simply refuse to negotiate. But perhaps there are now options or opportunities through which relations can be pursued that either don't affect the central authority that much or can do so in a way which is mutually beneficial. I would urge the Afar people to not only create your list of priority interests, but also create and understand the reciprocal list of priorities, including fears on the part of your interlocutors or those who would oppose you, and then to be able to understand which ones, or identify, I should say, which ones are more likely for you to find mutual agreement. And then, so we often call these entry points for a process of negotiation, where you might be able to find, on the basis of mutual benefit, an accord, an agreement, and create that arrangement in material terms, which are then experienced over time and can transform over time as development occurs to mutual benefit. From that, through that kind of process, you develop relationships which can be expanded, which give you, over time, more effective say, more forms of participation through advisory, technical, and other bodies, and deliver more control through, in the sense of influence and decision-making, than might otherwise be possible at this time. Let me conclude by saying that I think all of this begs a basic question of very sober assessments and calculations around the realities of your situation, including opponents, specifically opponents, but also what is your strategy? And strategy here should be distinguished from tactics. I don't mean your current practices of your own organization or contacts, but over time, what are those long processes that you would wish that you need to invest in to increase the chances of success, that you have greater voice, more effective participation, and ultimately more influence and control over your destiny, over your life. And I think this may require a process of education of some of your interlocutors, not just yourselves, but of others. For example, if you were to appear in Addis Ababa and start discussing with counterparts who are not well informed about options of internal self-determination, I wouldn't even use that phrase. I would talk about mutually beneficial arrangements for the management of diverse situations. And then I would be very concrete. I would say, if we have an issue over the distribution and use of water, how can we do that in a mutually beneficial and sustainable way? And having a very precise discussion that does not invite an immediate negative reaction on the part of counterparts that forecloses the possibility of the objective, the end that you seek. In other words, that your strategy contributes to a virtuous cycle and a constructive relationship over time that can be normalized and then potentially expanded or multiplied. So I'm suggesting here not only a conceptual approach, but a practical approach, which is really about problem solving. And it is one which depends not on so much external recognition, as external interest, who would be supportive of your own ambitions, your own interests in practical terms and in a step-by-step process. I hope that this might be helpful. I would be glad to respond to any more precise questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Packer. That is a great advice, and it's timely one